Good morning. I'm Gord Long with the Financial Repression Authority. As part of our ongoing guest series on financial repression, I have Dr. Paul Roberts joining us again this morning. Dr. Roberts is the chairman of the Institute for Political Economy and a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, for Economic Policy in the Reagan administration. Welcome back, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you.
I just read an article from yesterday. It was featured on Zero Hedge, and it was called "Democracy has Departed the West." And there was a quote in it. If you don't mind me, I'd like to read it, and then we can go from there, because I thought you just nailed it. Quote, "As far as I can tell, not only has democracy departed the Western world, but also compassion, empathy for others, morality, integrity, respect for truth, justice, fairness, and self-respect. Western civilization has become a hollow shell. There is nothing left but greed and coercion and the threat of coercion." You don't feel strongly about that, do you?
Well, it's just a factual statement.
It is. I believe I support you.
Nothing to do with feelings. It's just a factual statement, and it's based on the behavior and statements of the government itself. And it's based on the public's acceptance of illegality, unconstitutionality, constant lies. You know, we've been destroying countries for 14 years. It's about 7 countries we've destroyed. One consequence is that we're hated all over the world. Another consequence is that Europe is now overrun with millions of refugees from our destruction of countries. And yet we continue this policy. And the public is not disturbed. And so what other conclusion can one draw?
Why do you think the public isn't disturbed by this?
I think it's several reasons. One is they don't get information, because the media, 90% of the American media, is owned by 6 large mega corporations. And they serve basically as a ministry of propaganda, the government line, the corporate line, and you never get any challenge of that, not on any substantial issue. So the public has no source of information. That's one of the things I try to provide. The second is the public really is just sort of inured. It doesn't know what's going on, and so it assumes that all these people are bad people over there. They're bad people. The Russians are a threat. Putin's the new Hitler. The Chinese steal our secrets. So whatever happens to those people, they don't care. They think the Muslims deserve death and destruction because, they're responsible for 9/11. They did this, they did that. So they really don't have any empathy for these other countries, these other peoples, because all they get is a barrage of propaganda from the American media and the American government.
I found, to support that I read the foreign media pretty well dominantly. Not that it's not slanted, but it's, at least I get some semblance of the story, where in the U.S. media I find the story is not told. It's just left off. It's not necessarily distorted. It's just not told. Have you noticed the same thing? Or?
Well, the story that is told by the American media is Washington's propaganda line. And, of course, whatever the corporation propaganda lines are. And there's no challenge to either. Maybe on some minor issues, but not on anything that's of really major importance. So the media functions as a ministry of propaganda for the government and for the corporations. And they know that. If any reporter tried to get into the heart of something, he'd lose his job, and the editor would also lose a job for letting him. And they all know that. They tell me that. I mean, it's not that they're all corrupt and like to lie, but they need a job. This is their career. How does a journalist become a mechanical engineer or do something else? And so they're forced into a way of life in order to survive economically. And they know that. I was an important figure in journalism for years. I know a lot of journalists.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, that was a big part of your career at a very senior level.
Yeah, and this was before Clinton allowed 6 mega corporations to concentrate the entire media. You know, this policy that Clinton permitted is totally against our tradition. It's against the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's against the fact that our democracy needs to succeed a dispersed and independent media. Well, we've lost that. We do not have a dispersed and independent media. You know, there used to be thousands of independent news organizations. And now 90% are in the hands of 6 mega companies. So there's no independence, and the control is overwhelming. And that's that. And the new generations of journalists coming up, they don't know any different. They don't know it was ever any different. And they think their function is to support the government, to support the corporate advertisers, that's the way you make money and keep the paycheck coming. So they don't know any difference. They don't even know what investigative journalism is.
So the days of Walter Cronkite of telling us the facts, who, what, where, why, it's now being replaced with selling a mission or a message, rather, or staying on point.
Right. Yeah, no, they wouldn't put up with Cronkite.
That is terrifying, obviously. You wrote...
and he wasn't really perfect. I mean, you know, he would sometimes take the government's line. But at least they knew what they were supposed to be doing.
You wrote another article, all the Republican candidates stand for war. And you mentioned this perpetual situation of war that we're continuously in. What were the points you were trying to make in that article to support them?
Well, I was just observing and reporting what they said. If you watch the debate between the Republican candidates, I mean, it's not a debate. I don't know what it is. I don't know why they call them debates. You know, they have 1 minute to make a point, and they have 30 seconds to respond. I mean, how is this a debate? With so many people, how is this a debate? So, but the whole thing was about, you know, I'm tougher than you are. I'll push the button against the Russians. You won't. You had this Carly figure, the woman who wasn't thought by the directors to be fit to run Hewlett-Packard, but she thinks she's fit to run the United States. And she was up there saying all the things she would do. You know, I'll rebuild the Sixth Fleet. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with the Sixth Fleet. I guess what she means is she'll build another one. We could do that, but we aren't. But I will, and I'll put troops on Russia's border. We could do that. We aren't, but I will. I mean, it was all this threatening aggression toward a nuclear power like Russia. So do you want to be led by people who are going to create distrust between nuclear powers and bring back the risk of Armageddon? You know, every American president since John F. Kennedy worked with the Soviet leadership to defuse the nuclear issue. You know, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev both saw that, you know, we just about came to nuclear blows. That would have been the end of the world. We have to get this under control. And they worked, and everybody else did. And you have to remember with Nixon, you know, all the arms control agreements he made with the Soviet leadership. He opened to communist China to quieten all that down. All administrations worked to create trust between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and China. And finally, Reagan was able to end the Cold War. He basically came to agreement with Gorbachev, and all the threat of some nuclear miscalculation, nuclear accident, all this was gone. And the George Herbert Walker Bush administration respected that. But once Clinton got in, he broke all the agreements. And then George W. Bush broke more agreements. You know, he pulled out of the ABM Treaty. He rewrote American strategic doctrine to permit nuclear weapons as a first strike, preemptive attack. It had always been a retaliatory thing that you only used if you were attacked. But under the Bush people, under the Bush neoconservatives, nuclear weapons became a first strike force. Well, all this is very threatening to other countries. And so they managed to destroy the achievements of Reagan and Gorbachev, for which, or toward which, every American president since John F. Kennedy had worked. So, and we see every one of these candidates continuing with that. Nobody said, hey, look, we've got to get this back under control. We've let the Armageddon possibility loose again. We can't talk like this. We have to have trust with nuclear powers. We can't threaten them. We can't run around comparing them to Hitler, saying they're a greater threat than Ebola and the Islamic State. Nobody said that. They were all competing to show how...
What's caused this shift? Because it was right across all the candidates, more or less, to varying degrees. Yeah. Is it campaign finance from the military-industrial complex, or is it shift in our culture?
It's both. It's Carly, what's her name, was advertising she was for sale. She was telling the military security complex, send in the money, get me elected, it'll come right back to you. I'll build fleets, I'll do this, I'll do that. I mean, she was just telling them, look, buy me, I'm here. Give me the money, it's come back to you. It'll come back to you, I promise. So, yeah, that's part of it. And part of it is this notion that we are chosen by history to exercise hegemony over the world. You know, the Soviet collapse produced this neoconservative fantasy about the end of history. The history had chosen the United States, what they call democratic capitalism, which is neither democratic nor capitalist, to be the final social economic system on earth, and that it's our right and responsibility to impose this on others. So we bring freedom and democracy, about bombing people. So, yeah, it's the population that they think that's what they're supposed to be doing. So,
but you wrote that democracy has departed the West. Hmm? Why? Why is that?
Well, look, there are many reasons, but the example I used for that particular column was the choice of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the British Labour Party, because he is a real Labourite, unlike Tony Blair and the others who are just corporate lackeys, Washington poodles. The Labour chose a real Labour member, and overwhelmingly. And the Tories are so stupid and corrupt, the likelihood is that this guy will be the next Prime Minister of England. So what happened was a senior general in the British military, a serving general, not some retired Fox News general, but a guy in actual command, told the press that we're not going to permit Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. If they elect him, we'll remove him. So, in other words, here's the British military saying, we will not accept a democratic outcome. And nobody screamed to know who said this. Who said this? This guy has to be removed from the military. He's threatening a coup in a democracy? What does he think this is, So nothing has happened. The guy's there. This intimidation has had a lot of effect. Now Labor people are worrying, can we really put this guy in there if they're going to have a coup? It's an amazing thing. So I don't think you need any more evidence than that. But I could go on and on and on.
My reaction was the same. Where is the outrage that a military leader could make a statement like that and not be immediately removed? Yeah. But it was.
He's not even identified.
Maybe I guess so.
See, the journalists didn't identify him. The Parliament didn't call in and say, "Look, this is serious. Who is this?" Or they didn't call in the senior officers and say, "Okay, which one of you?" So you have a coup plotted against democracy. So I think that, in other words, you see the neoliberal economic order in which the 1% controls everything. Well, this is not acceptable to the British Labour Party. And so they're going to get rid of the British Labour Party. You know, they hired Tony Blair to get rid of it. He just about did. I mean, why would anybody vote for Labour when they do the same as the Tories? They cut everybody's benefits. They destroy the welfare state that puts stability in society. They act just like right-wing Republicans. So who's going to vote for them? So the Labour said, hey, we got to get back to our roots. And they put up a guy who represents the people. And so the military says, well, we won't accept any such person.
You know, it's just shocking that the members of Parliament, British Parliament, were screaming for this person's name and dismissal. But I don't think it's about just the British government. You wrote about the scourge in Washington,
Yeah.
and what we have. Is it any different in Washington? Would
No.
would our politicians react differently? We would hope so, but
No. Well, they don't. The way it works here is nobody can rise to office now who doesn't represent the 1%. So they're not threatened. There's no way Jeremy Corbyn is going to come up as a presidential candidate in the United States. It's not possible. They would get no funding. He'd get no coverage. It's not, so we don't have the kind of threat, but the Labour Party in Britain is different. It used to be, and it looks like this guy wants to bring it back. You know, if he looks too successful, there'll either be a coup or they'll simply assassinate him.
The primaries this year, which seem to be starting earlier and earlier, and with so many in the Republican list, as you said, it wasn't even a debate, or we haven't even seen a debate here. Is this because of the campaign contribution, campaign financing changes that came down from the Supreme Court, and there's just more money out there to be able to start a campaign run?
Yeah. There's more money, plus there are more candidates.
So somebody...
You don't have a whole row of people like that. So, yeah, it's more money, more candidates, so it starts earlier.
But I noticed there's more candidates on the Republican side by an order of magnitude than on the Democratic side. Does that tell us about campaign money that's available?
Well, I think it's maybe harder for the Democrats when they have a president in office. You get too many of them out there, and for long they start having to differentiate themselves from the guy in office. And that's sort of risky because that can play into the other party's hands. They'll say, see, even the Democrats don't like their own policies, blah, blah. So I don't know. Or it may just be they're not as many ambitious Democrats.
Are there solutions to this problem, to what we're talking about here, this steady, consistent corruption, coercion, where our government just isn't doing the job that it should be doing?
Not internally, no, because no candidate inclined or capable of correcting the situation could be elected, and even if it happened by happenstance, without a movement behind the person, he wouldn't have any people to put in office to follow him, and a presidential appointee has to be confirmed by the Senate, mm-hmm. And they're all controlled by the special interest groups. So if you were to get a president inclined to do something different, he wouldn't be able to anyhow, because who would he appoint? First of all, he wouldn't know anybody unless there's a movement. It has to be a movement. To have change, you have to have a movement, and the leader has to represent the movement, and he has to know the people in it and know who he can rely on to bring about the changes and put them in office. Now, without a movement, there's no such people. Without a real strong movement, the Senate would simply not confirm the appointees. So remember what they did to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was an outsider, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The Democratic establishment wasn't pleased to have a non-Washington insider as president. So what did they do? The first thing they did, they framed up his budget director and got rid of Burt Lentz. The second thing they did, they framed up his chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan. So they neutered Carter, and they stuck in their people. So what could Carter do? He couldn't do anything. You know, they almost did this to Reagan. He had just enough people on his side that he could end the stagflation and end the Cold War. The military security complex didn't want to end the Cold War. The CIA opposed that. Reagan had to fight them. He had to go against them. And if he hadn't had Don Reagan there, he couldn't have done it. And the tax program, the supply-side tax program, Wall Street was opposed to it. I was only able to get that through the administration because I had the president's strong support and I had Don Reagan's support. If it had just been a different assistant secretary there in place of me, it wouldn't have happened. If it had been a different Treasury secretary, it wouldn't have happened. If Don Reagan hadn't moved over to be chief of staff of the White House, Reykjavik wouldn't have happened. There wouldn't have been any end of the Cold War. So, you know, the president can't do things if he doesn't have a team that helps him. And the agendas in Washington they're all over the place. And the reason people want a presidential appointment is to achieve their own agenda, which usually is to make favors for some powerful interest group, so when they get out, they have a huge job. So, you know, change is not, politically, it's not possible. It could come through collapse. It could come through defeat. It could come through just being irrelevant. You know, if we keep bullying the Russians, the Chinese, and the rest of the world, they'll just turn their backs on us and go about their business.
Adam Hamilton, was a great theory that said about the invisible hand, and that is that capitalism worked because of the pursuit of profits, steered decisions without really central control. Is what's happening in Washington a conspiracy? Is it planned? Is it organized? Or is this just part of the culture that's moving us in this direction?
It's both. You know, we've had all of this free market propaganda for years. And it was a response to Roosevelt and the New Deal. And even when I was doing graduate work in economics, 50 years ago, the only free market my professors could identify was small farm agriculture, which was already disappearing into corporate agriculture. There's no such thing as a free market in the United States. It requires many producers, none of which can affect price. Well, where we see we have concentration. Look at the banks. The banks are so concentrated they're too big to fail. Well, how do you have capitalism if a failed enterprise doesn't close down? Instead, it's bailed out by the people, by the Federal Reserve, printing money to buy up its worthless portfolio. This is not capitalism. There's no capitalism here. And this is an oligarchy in which the distribution of income and wealth in the United States in the last 20 years is now worse than in many third world bandit countries. So you don't have an economy anymore. There's no growth in real consumer income. So how does the economy grow? It can't. If people's incomes aren't growing, it doesn't. There's nothing to push the economy. There's no consumer demand. Why would people invest? Why would corporations invest? So it's, in a way, it's, we can financialize everything. We can collect up all the surplus in the society and bank fees and interest by issuing more debt. The more debt we can issue, the more of the country's income is drawn off in fees and interest. And that's the way this system works. This is not capitalism. The financial system really doesn't finance industry. It creates debt instruments. It takes economic rents, which should be taxed. Instead, it capitalizes them into instruments that provide interest to the financial sector.
When I was a young man,
this has nothing to do with capitalism.
when I was a young man, or younger, we were continuously facing monopoly lawsuits, whether to break up AT&T, whether to break up IBM. Rockefeller, 50 years before that, was to break up Standard Oil. But it's been a continuous fight for 100 years, except in the last 25 years, I do not recall a single Sherman Act prosecution being brought. Even though we've had more concentration, which you would think would beg more of these questions, I haven't seen one. That is, to me, how dramatic the shift is. So we've lost capitalism, and the point I would make, and what I would observe, is when you have that competition, you get more for less. But when you don't have it, you get less for more, and you're stretched even thinner. And it seems to be what we've fallen into. Is that a fair observation?
Yes, it is. The Sherman Antitrust Act now is a dead letter law. And the argument is, we can't compete unless we have massive firms. And globalism means for America to compete, essentially everything has to end up in the hands of a few people. They have to be massive firms in order to compete. So this type of argument, which was created by economists, paid off by corporations, with research grants, consulting fees, board memberships. Some of them even got Nobel Prizes. They created this notion that, the Sherman Antitrust Act, that would endanger our competitive ability. So they turned it on its head. You see, the whole purpose of the Sherman Antitrust Act was to ensure competition. But they say, but now the competition is global. We have globalism, and we're competing with other countries and trading blocks, and China. So we have to have massive corporations. So I think that there's been that sort of shift. And when the economists think and talk and write that way, then the regulators follow.
I think they've got the cart in front of the horse, because anybody that sat in a board meeting of a major corporation, you'll quickly find out that the members there are from all around the world. There's no thing as they're American. They're representing the Japanese pension fund or whatever, and so they're global in their perspective. And you could say, well, they're U.S. domiciled. Well, with special purpose entities, etc., the money's all kept offshore anyway. So what is an American corporation anymore? Because they're global corporations. So I understand where they want to be competitive, but I don't know if that's necessarily helping America.
Well, I'm not saying that argument is correct. I think it's a ruse. It's a cover. It's a cloak.
Oh, clearly.
For enrichment of the 1%. I don't believe the argument that they've made up that stands the Sherman Antitrust Act on its head. It's just a ruse, like everything else. I mean, everything they tell you is self-serving. What has the government said that's true? Can you think of anything? Can you think of anything they've said that's true? We know the unemployment rate, the report is false. The inflation rate's false. The gross domestic product number is false. We know all of this. We know that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. He did not have al-Qaeda connections. We know that Assad of Syria did not use chemical weapons. We know that Russia did not invade Ukraine. But they say this over and over and over. I can't think of one thing that the government or the corporate world has said in 20 years that's true.
Well, a recent survey says 60 to 70% of Americans believe exactly what you just said. They don't trust the government. They don't trust Washington.
Well, but
I don't think they know what they can do about it, because the candidate list they have seems to give them no choice or little choice.
Well, that's a good sign. If 60 or 70% are catching on, things can change. If the people can catch on despite the news being nothing but a propaganda mechanism, this is a very good sign. And once the people catch on, enough of them, and you already got a majority catching on, oh boy, yes, things can change then.
Is that why Donald Trump is so popular on one side, Bernie Sanders on the other side, because
Yeah.
they're clearly non-traditional candidates.
Yeah, I think that's the reason they're both popular, despite other things that they do and say. And whether this is real or a ruse, I have no idea. But I welcome it because it certainly is causing discomfort for the establishment in the Democratic Party and the establishment in the Republican Party. And there's nothing to be more welcome than to discredit those two establishments. The Democratic and Republican establishment both are totally corrupt. They have no concept of the country or the interests of the country. They have only concept of self-interest for them, for their benefactors. So Sanders and Trump are refreshing. I hope they're real. It doesn't mean they can win because there's powerful forces arrayed against them. But we'll just have to see. And it doesn't mean if they win, they know what to do. I mean, they can challenge and say challenging things, but does Trump really know what needs to be done? And who will he end up relying on?
Well, he's going to put Carl Icahn in charge of global trade negotiations now, so he's already picking his candidates.
Yeah. Well, I think on the whole it'd be hard for either Trump or Sanders to bring any positive changes for the reasons I said earlier in our discussion, our conversation. That they don't have a movement. They don't know people. They don't know who. First of all, they don't know what needs to be done, or they only know a few things. And so they'll end up captive. They'll be a captive. In the end, the powerful Roman emperors were captives of the Praetorian Guard. And if the guard didn't like it, they removed them.
We're up against our hard line. Great conversation. There's so much more to go here. So many more questions I'd like to ask you, but we'll have to have you back at another day. Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. Is there a site, place that people could go to follow your writings, your work, your other interviews?
Yes, there's a website. It's just my name, www.paulcraigroberts.org. And they can find what I have to say there.
Thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Bye-bye.